Now let's get into this whole category we call middle passive. Now, as we go on, you're going to see that in some tenses we separate these. We separate the concept of a middle and a passive. In the present tense, when we speak of the passive voice. Now, this is dealing specifically with this concept of voice. And so we have this form called the middle passive form, or the middle passive voice, in the present tense indicative work of the verb system. So now let's talk a little bit about what's happening, and then in the next lecture we're going to lay out the forms as we put out the middle passive. Okay, so the passive. We've already talked about this, and this is something that does express itself in English. So the passive form of a verb is when the subject is acted upon in the action of the verb. It's still the subject of the sentence, so it doesn't make this a direct object, because in some ways a direct object also receives the action of the verb. But in this sense, the subject is being acted upon rather than doing the action. So there's a couple things that you can help to kind of recognize this. A lot of times you're going to see a helping verb. Now, not all the times that you use a helping verb create a passive. But sometimes if you see being, been in different tenses, you're going to sense in that that's kind of got that passive force. That's how we bring it into the English. But not all passive voice verbs have that helping verb with it. And so there's other ways to think about it. Like, for example, the simple verb I was hit, or I am hit, in the present tense. So in that is conveyed I am the subject, but it's not that I'm hitting somebody. That's different to say I hit you, or I hit the person, or I hit the ball. That's the subject I doing the hitting. But if I'm hit, that is the subject I receiving the action or being acted upon. So if you want to understand, a lot of times, and Mounce uses this, it's helpful, if you kind of put the preposition by after the verb and you can fill it in, that's probably a passive tense. So I am hit by a ball. Okay? Or I am hit by a fist. Okay, so if you can put by and then put something after it, then what you've got functioning there is a passive verb. Now, a passive is that the subject is strongly affected by the action of the verb. And so when you use the helping verb, if you need to carry it, the action back upon the subject, you have to remember that sometimes, to make it make sense in English, we have to supply that helping verb, but in doing that, the tense, the timing, that tense timing sense of it is actually carried by the helping verb. So I am remembered. Well, remembered feels like a past tense, but I am is the present tense, and the helping verb is what carries the timing sense of the verb. So just remember that. Make sure that if you have to supply a helping verb, you got to make sure you're using the right tense. Even if you make the verb itself, if it has to morph a little bit to become a past tense, that helping verb will keep it in the right sense of time for the present tense. Okay. Now let's take it down to middle. Passives we're familiar with passives, but middles are a little different. We don't really have that in English. We find ways to try to translate it. Sometimes we don't even find ways to translate it. So there's been different ways the grammarians have spoken about this. The easiest way historically that they tended to translate the middle or to view the middle was to say that it was reflexive. In other words, you would use the word like himself or herself to translate it back, that the action of the verb is acting backwardly upon. Not in the same way that a passive is fully, but that when the subject acts, the subject is also impacted. The terminology, the grammatical terminology of subject affected. Subject affected. So in other words, the subject of the sentence, it's not that they're fully receiving the action of the verb like a passive, but that the subject is somehow engaged and receiving it. That used to be translated reflexively or reciprocally would be another way to put that. Well, they're kind of broadening that now, and because that didn't always capture what was happening. So now the idea that when a middle is used, somehow in some way the subject is affected. Sometimes it can be reflexively, and you could use the word himself. Other times it's more subtle than that. There are going to be times that you're going to translate a middle simply as a active in English. It's the way it comes across. Sometimes you're going to do it for that sense of internal reciprocity, that reflexivity coming back, and you're going to add in a reflexive pronoun with it. You're going to have to kind of feel that through the individual usages. But it has that broader sense. Now here's the reality. Whether you're talking a middle or a passive, in the Greek present tense, the form is identical. That's important to recognize. So you're going to try to get a feel. Is this a passive? Can you put the word by at the end of it? In fact, Greek itself does do that. It'll put the Greek preposition following the verb oftentimes because it's completing, just like we do in English, by the ball. It's going to complete the action by supplying a prepositional phrase for us. So just know that. And recognize if it's a passive, it should be clear. And you're going to have to translate it with either a helping verb or you may be able to translate it, but it's always going to have that sense of that passive voice in it. Middle's a little more complicated. Now, here's the thing when we're talking about the form. Some Greek verbs show up in certain tenses, in like this case, the present tense, without an active form. It never has the active form available to it. It's never used. And it's not just that it doesn't show up in the New Testament like being used in the New Testament. It's never used in the language. So there's a very common word, erchomai. Erchomai, that's the lexical form. That ending on there, and we're going to talk about the endings in the next lecture, that is the middle passive primary ending, amai. And so if the lexical form of the word, of the verb, is a middle passive form, then that's a unique kind of word. It doesn't have an active form. Generally, these are translated as actives. There's a little difference in the way different books deal with this. Historically, these are called a verb that does not have an active form in the present tense would be called a deponent. A deponent means exactly what that definition is that it doesn't have an active form. It only has a middle passive form. And so erchomai is one of those words. That's the most common one that we tend to use when we create our paradigms. So understand that if you go to the lexical form, you're not going to find like ercho. It's not there. So it's going to be erchomai. And when you're parsing, if you find a word, if you have a word that does not have an active form, that when it asks for voice, you don't want to call it a passive because it's not a passive. You could call it, and this is what Mounce has now come to. He prefers the term, it appears in his text, current edition, the 4th edition, middle only, calling these middle onlys. And I think the reason that maybe he's going that way is that most of these words have that sense of, well, whether it be for movement or grooming or some sense of, all of these words that don't conjugate in the active have a sense of a middle sense to it. So he's going with the term middle only. He says, ask your teacher what they prefer. I actually still prefer deponent. I think it's helpful. It sets it apart. It's a little clearly, more differently. It also helps you to be very clear. This does not have that form. And generally, just remember, a deponent verb is going to be translated not as a middle or as a passive, as a reflexive or as a fully a passive. It's going to generally be translated simply as an active. That's why calling it a middle only is okay. I get why they're doing it. There's nothing wrong with that. But calling it a deponent reminds me this must be translated as an active. Okay. So those are the important things as we kind of set up. The next lecture will just be on the forms. And essentially you're going to learn, now that we understand the difference between the function of a passive and the function of a middle, when we come to the forms, we're just going to focus on the form because there's only one form for both of those voices in present tense Greek.